Hi everyone, it's James from the Fit RV, and in this video, we're going to have a basic and hopefully useful chat about RV electrical systems. By the end of this video, you might not be a pro, but you should know enough about RV electrical systems that you can enjoy a weekend of camping with full use of your RV's electrical components without being mystified or afraid. Now this video is sponsored by our friends at Winnebago RVs, so a big thank you there. But, and this is important to note, the information we're going to cover here is not Winnebago specific. It should be applicable to most RVs out there, motorized or towable, new, old. All you need to follow along is an RV and a desire to know more about it. So let's get started. Now the first thing I need to tell you though is to read your manual. And I know, buzzkill, right? But that's not the most exciting thing I could ever tell you, but it is important. Why? Well, the information I can give you in a video like this is going to be general in nature because I don't know what kind of a rig you have. So like here we can go over how things typically work in RVs and I'll cover some best practices, but I don't know, for example, what that big switch in your storage compartment does. But your owner's manual knows, and that's why you should read it. And even though Steph and I have been RVing a long time, whenever we get a hold of a new RV, I still take the time to read the manual, and I always find something I wouldn't have known otherwise. And finally, if I should mention something here and your manual says something different, well then your owner's manual should take precedence. So do read your owner's manual, but probably just not right now because you're here watching this video. Now, the very first thing you need to know about your RV's electrical system is that it actually has two electrical systems. There's the 12-volt system, which is like something you'd see in a car, and there's the 120-volt system, which is like what you'll find in your house. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this. There are some RVs out there with 48-volt batteries, but that's not super common just yet. And RVs in France, for example, they'll have a 220-volt electrical system. But to keep things simple, we're just going to stick to these two electrical systems for now. And we're going to be focused on just the basics. So let's pretend you just bought a new RV and you wanted to take it out for a weekend of camping. If that's the case, then what do you need to know about these two electrical systems on day one? Well, the first thing is you need to know what devices run on each of the electrical systems. You'll also need to know where each of these electrical systems gets its power from. You'll need to know how to turn each one of these electrical systems on and off. And heaven forbid, you need to know what to do if something doesn't work. So that's kind of the roadmap. Those are the things we're going to cover in this video. Okay, so starting with the 12-volt system. What runs on the 12-volt system? Things that run on 12 volts are going to be what I'll just say are kind of your lighter loads, things that don't require tons and tons of power. So that'll be things like the lighting in your RV, ceiling fans, your water pump, your monitor panel, USB outlets if you've got them. I'll also say your furnace probably runs on 12 volts. Not for the source of heat, that's usually something like propane, but for the fan that blows the warm air around to where you want it, that fan is probably a 12-volt fan. Refrigerators in RVs can be a bit different because there are lots of different ways they can be powered. They can run on 12 volts like the one in our Winnebago Echo. They can also be powered with propane, mind blower, or 120-volt power, or perhaps even all three. It just kind of depends on the fridge. But whatever kind you have, there will most likely be some part of that RV refrigerator that requires 12-volt power, even if it's maybe just the light. Now, the 120-volt system, this is going to run more of your heavy-duty loads. These are the things that take more power to run. And the big one here is the air conditioner. That's most likely a 120-volt appliance. Also the microwave and any regular-looking household outlets you see in your rig. I'll throw the refrigerator in here as well, maybe, for the reasons we just said. And your water heater. If it has an electric option on your water heater, that option will run on 120-volt power. I'll include your RV's entertainment system in this list as well. If you have a newer RV and it has one. Years ago, like when we got our very first RV, 12-volt televisions were fairly common. But these days, they're kind of rare. It's a lot more economical for RV manufacturers to put standard off-the-shelf components in an RV and then to provide inverter power for the one or two outlets that those things are plugged into. But we haven't gotten to inverters yet, so hang on for that. Now that you know what runs on it, let's have a deeper look at the 12-volt system. Where does it get its power from? It gets its power from your RV's battery bank. And so one of your very first tasks to orient yourself to a new RV is to figure out where your battery bank is. Like on a smaller travel trailer, the battery bank could be as simple as a single battery in a box on the A-frame part of the trailer, on the tongue. On a large Class A, it might be several batteries together in a basement storage compartment on kind of a slide-out tray. In our own Echo, I've got a 5-battery bank that I've put underneath a dinette seat. There are lots of options here. But do take the time to identify your battery bank. You'll feel better knowing where it is and how you can access it if you need to. Besides where is it, the next most important thing to know about your battery bank is how do I check the state of charge? Like how much is left in the tank, so to speak. And here again, there are almost as many solutions as there are RVs, but the most basic way to check your state of charge is from your RV's control panel. And every RV I've ever seen has a control panel of some sort. And they've all had a way to perform at least a basic check on the battery. Now, this is an area where your owner's manual may come in handy because that panel could be something like press this button and you'll get lights at 1/4, 1/2, 3/4 full. It could even be like a color changing dial, or it could be something like checking a smartphone app for newer lithium batteries. You'll also want to know how to turn the batteries on and off. And again, this will be different depending on your RV. Like a very simple electrical system might just require you to physically disconnect the cables from the battery at the terminals to shut the system down. Newer batteries, like lithium batteries, may include a switch directly on the battery itself to shut it down. And your RV itself may have a battery disconnection switch, which could be a big honking switch kind of like this, or a little remote switch like this that hooks up with a relay. Or there could even be an app-based function to turn off your RV's battery. The important thing is that you find out the procedure to shut down your RV's battery power, and perhaps more importantly, find out the procedure for turning it back on again. Finally, there's a question of how do you charge the battery? And here again, there can be multiple answers depending on your RV. So like if you have a motorhome, for example, the motorhome's batteries most likely charge anytime the engine is running. If your RV has solar panels, then solar could also be charging your house batteries. And there's a lot to RV solar. It could be like its whole own video, but for now, it's best to just think of solar power as something that is charging your RV's house batteries. And for the most part, there's nothing you have to do with pre-installed RV solar systems. They just kind of work. But one of the most common ways to charge your 12-volt system's batteries is by using your other electrical system, the 120-volt system, which makes a fantastic segue. So let's jump into that next. Now, before we can start charging batteries with the 120-volt system, it also has to have power. And the most common ways to get 120-volt power in your RV are either with shore power, or by using a generator, or by using something called an inverter. So we're going to look at each one of these. So let's start with shore power. And this is definitely something you're going to want to know like day one, right away when you're getting started. We call it shore power, even though our RVs aren't boats, or not usually in the water, at least not intentionally. These are the pedestals you're going to see at campgrounds and parks with hookups, and getting power from them is pretty simple. First thing you need to do, find the pedestal at your campsite. And I'll put up a picture of one, and I wish I could tell you that they'll all be this clean and well maintained, but that is absolutely not always the case. One time I opened one of these and found a hornet's nest, and that was an exception. Generally, they're pretty okay, but it never hurts to be ready for anything. The next thing you'll need to know is if your RV is a 30 amp RV or a 50 amp RV. Now this just refers to how much current can be safely run through the shore power connection. Generally speaking, 30 amp rigs are smaller, so something like a Class B camper van, a smaller travel trailer would have a 30 amp connection, and a larger fifth wheel with 3 air conditioners, well, that's probably going to have a 50 amp connection. You need to know which type your rig is because they use different plugs on the pedestal. And those plugs will each have a circuit breaker associated with them. And so the next thing you're going to do is to turn off the circuit breaker for the connection you're about to make. That way you're not hooking up anything while it's live. So now with the breaker off, it's time to hook up. Generally, I'd recommend using the cord your RV came with because it's going to be the right type and gauge for your RV. You've already found the right connection on the pedestal, and the other end, the end on your RV, that's going to be somewhere towards the rear on the driver's side, kind of back here somewhere. That's typically where they are. The two ends of the cord should be different, so you're not likely to make a mistake here. And once you've got it securely plugged in on both ends, go ahead and flip that breaker on the pedestal back on, and presto, you'll have 120 volt power. It is important to check and make sure that you've plugged it in like all the way securely. You don't want any loose connections here, because if they're not connected properly, they can heat up, and that's bad. You don't want that. So that's hooking up to campground power or shore power. But what if you're not at a campground or there's no grid power to be had? Well, another option for getting 120 volt power is to use a generator. So how do you do that? Well, RV generators can be either built in, that's already installed in your RV, or they can be standalone. And I thought about calling them portable, but some of them are really pretty large, so it's a stretch to call it portable. So let's talk about a built-in generator first. If your RV has a built-in generator, there should be a control panel with a switch somewhere inside your RV, and you'll use that to start the generator. And it's pretty typical that you'll just hold down the start button, kind of like turning a key in a car, and you hold it until the engine turns over and it's running on its own. You'll know when that happens. Once the built-in generator is running, after 30 seconds or so, when the engine's kind of smoothed out and stabilized, you hear a click. And then you'll have 120 volt power in the RV. Now that click is from something called a transfer switch. And what that does is basically takes your RV's electrical system, and instead of pointing it at shore power as a source of power, it will point it at the generator instead. Now let's look at standalone generators. Those are generally something you purchase after the fact, and the power-up procedure kind of depends on which generator you get. But the short how-to on these generators is that you plug your RV into the generator just the same as you would plugging it into shore power. But, and here's kind of an important thing, you don't want there to be any load on these generators when you start them. And there's no automatic transfer switch. In this case, you are the transfer switch. So it's a good idea to go inside your RV, flip the main breaker off, then connect the power cord, then start the generator. Now, starting them is usually some kind of lawnmower kind of action. And once it's started and it's smoothed out and running, then you, the transfer switch, go inside and flip the main breaker back on, and then you're good to go. Okay, so now let's talk about inverters, converters, and inverter chargers. So by now, you're well aware that your RV has two electrical systems, a 12 volt system represented here with a battery, and 120 volt represented by a wall outlet. Well, those systems are not completely separate. There are some devices that speak both 12 volt and 120 volt, and they can move energy from one system to another. We'll start off with inverters. These are devices that take energy from your batteries and use that to produce 120 volt AC power. So that's another way to get that 120 volt power if you don't have shore power and you don't have a generator. You'll use an inverter. Then there are converters, which kind of do the opposite. They take energy from the 120 volt AC system and they produce 12 volt DC power with it. These have been used in RV for a long time, and they're how a house battery gets charged when your RV is plugged in or running a generator. In those cases, you have the AC power, so the converter generates some 12 volt power to charge the batteries, run the lights, etc., etc. And then there are inverter chargers. These provide the functions of both inverters and converters, and before you asked, I looked and I could not find out why they're called inverter chargers and not inverter converters. But the name really isn't the important bit. What's important to know is that an inverter charger will either draw from your batteries to generate 120 volt AC power, or it will charge your batteries if you supply it with 120 volt current. And that charging is usually pretty automatic. Besides plugging in, there shouldn't be much that you need to do to make that happen. So now that you sort of know what inverters are, how are they used in RVs? Well, there are two ways, basically. The first and more common way is that a moderately powered inverter is used to power just some of the outlets in your RV. And by moderately powered, I mean something like an inverter with an 800 to 1000 watt capacity. Now, a common place you'll see this is in RV entertainment centers. Remember, today these use mostly off-the-shelf appliances, and in order to run them, you're going to need 120 volt power. So RV manufacturers will install an inverter, and that inverter will draw power from your house batteries and use that to provide power just to those couple outlets where like the TV and the Blu-ray player are plugged in. So you press a button to turn the inverter on, and presto, you can watch Top Gun out in the forest. But nothing is free. So remember, that inverter is drawing power from your batteries. So you will be draining down your house battery bank while you're doing that. And another thing to remember is that inverters typically have a standby load. In other words, like when you finish watching TV and you turn off the TV and go to bed, but you leave the inverter on, that inverter is still going to be consuming some battery power. Not as much as when you're watching explosions and whatnot, but some. because the inverter doesn't know. You might turn that TV back on at any moment, so it's got to be ready. So it's a best practice to turn an RV's inverter off unless you're actively doing something that's using that inverted power. It's just a smart thing to do, and it will save you some battery charge. Now, another way you might find an inverter connected is so that it can run everything in the RV, the entire 120 volt AC system. Now, this is admittedly less common, but it's becoming more common as time goes by. It's how our own RV is wired up, and it's done by putting the inverter ahead of the breaker panel. It requires a larger capacity inverter to be able to run everything that way. The upside of that approach is that we can have full use of all our RV's electrical systems at literally any time just by turning on the inverter. The caution here is that if you're going to be doing things like running an air conditioner and a microwave with your inverter, well, that's going to require kind of a lot of battery power, so you're going to need to stay on top of your energy management. So now let's talk circuit protection. Both your 12 volt and 120 volt electrical systems will have some overcurrent protection. On the 12 volt side, this is usually done with fuses, and these are most likely just the blade type fuses that you're used to seeing in vehicles. On the 120 volt side, this protection is provided with circuit breakers, just like in your home. Now, the purpose of these devices is to protect the wiring in your RV if something goes wrong and tries to pull more current through the wiring than it's really meant to handle. You want this protection, so please don't try to defeat it. Don't go putting a larger fuse in if the fuse blows. So, if something does go wrong, on the 12 volt side, a fuse will blow, or on the 120 volt side, a circuit breaker will trip for a 120 volt problem. Now, you may have to replace a fuse or reset a breaker, so it's a good idea to find the fuse panel and the circuit breaker in your RV before you need to, because then you may have to find it with the lights off. So your RV may have either separate fuse and circuit breaker panels, or the two of them may be combined into a single load center. And it never hurts to travel with a few extra fuses of the sizes that your RV requires. Finally, what if something goes wrong? Let's say it's a hot day, you finally get your RV down to the lake, you turn on the air conditioning, and nothing. The whole family is like staring at you, and if it wasn't hot enough already, now you're really starting to sweat. What do you do? Well, I've put together a flowchart of some very basic troubleshooting steps that you can try. Now, these may not solve the problem 100% of the time, but the idea is to at least get you started on the right path to solving the problem. Because there's always like just a million different things you could try, so we should at least get started by narrowing things down. So, something electrical in your RV isn't working. The first thing you need to ask yourself is this a 12 volt something that isn't working, or is it a 120 volt something that isn't working? Because right away, you want to cut the universe of possible problems in half. So in our example, the air conditioning isn't working. Well, that's, as of about 12 minutes ago now, you know that the air conditioner runs on the 120 volt electrical system. Perfect. So the next thing you ask yourself is it just this one 120 volt thing that's not working? Or is it all the 120 volt things that aren't working? This will let you know if it's a problem with the 120 volt system in general, or if the problem is isolated to just this one circuit or one appliance. So maybe you look over at the clock on the microwave and you see that the clock on the microwave is off. Not like blinking 12 o'clock, but just off. So it's probably not a problem with the air conditioner itself because the microwave is also off. The problem is just that your rig doesn't have 120 volt power at all. So in this example, let's say maybe you plugged into shore power, but you forgot to flip the breaker back on when you were done hooking up. Or maybe the cord got yanked out somehow, the dog yanked it out or something. Those are the kinds of things you're going to check in that instance. Now, this flowchart obviously doesn't solve every electrical problem you might ever encounter, but considering this is just a video about the basics, well, now you're at least going to have a shot at figuring it out. So, there you go, basic RV electrical systems. That's certainly not everything there is to know about RV electrical because that would take like a really long time, but it should be enough that you can at least get out there and enjoy a weekend of camping in your RV. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back for the next topic in the series where we'll tackle the basics of your RV's fresh water plumbing system. Bye for now.